Welcome again to our online Bible study from Pine Valley Church of Christ. And we are continuing our look at the book of Exodus. And last week we looked at the first 6 of the plagues and what they are able to do in terms of showing God's power over the nation of Egypt and their gods and their economy, and even over Pharaoh himself. Today we will be looking at the last 4 as they come to the culmination of finally truly setting the people free. And let me bring up our screen share. We know from our own history that when people are proclaimed to be free, as they were here in the United States in 1862, they don't always truly become free. Many things were put into place and laws and other systems to make sure that those former slaves could not have the same kind of freedom that their white owners had had or will have in the future. God understood that his people needed to be completely set apart and set free from the Egyptians. It had been his plan from the beginning. And the reason why he had them sent there was to protect them and allow them to grow. And we know from these chapters we'll see today that they have grown from those original 70 men and their families who moved to Egypt with Joseph. There is now over 600,000 men over the age of 20. And so that has been accomplished. But now it is time to set them free, truly to set them free and break those chains. But there are lessons they need to learn as well. The plagues are not just about what they teach the Egyptians, but it's what the lessons they teach the Israelites, especially in answer to the question that Pharaoh has asked, which is, who is Yahweh that I should obey him? I know nothing about him. Well, God is revealing himself to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians through these plagues, and has so far made sure that he has truly gotten their attention. He states in chapter 12, verse 12, which we'll get to in a little bit, that in that 10th plague, he's going to bring judgment upon all the gods of Egypt. He is showing the Egyptian people, and especially the Israelites, that he is the great God. He is the one God. He is the one who judges the gods of Egypt, those who have been made by men themselves. And it is to this conclusion which we continue to march as we go through the plagues. It's interesting as we begin looking at beginning in verse 13 of chapter 9, he starts after he is come through the first 6 plagues, to a time where he tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and say, look, I could have sent a plague on the country and destroyed the entire thing, or brought you into total submission, or wiped you off the face of the earth. That's what I could have done. But he says, I have actually raised you up. And verse 16, I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. This is not just something for Egypt. It's not just something for the Israelites even. It is a story that has truly spread throughout the world, throughout the centuries, and is something that is part of our history and our understanding of the life and the beginnings of the country of Israel. He says, I have raised you up. I could have completely destroyed you. This is gracious judgment that is taking place. This is what they deserved, especially after the way in which they've been treating the Israelites and enslaving them and killing them, and having the male children thrown into the river Nile. And so he says, I am now about to, as he says in verse 12 and 13, I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people. You will come to know. And so when Pharaoh refuses to listen, God has Moses go out and raise his hand, tells him what is going to happen, and tells Moses to inform Pharaoh and everybody else that this hail is coming, one like they've never seen before, and they need to get everybody inside, including their animals that are left, so that they will not be injured or killed by this horrible hailstorm that is coming. And it's interesting, we're told in verse 20 that the officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of Yahweh hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside, but those who ignored the word of Yahweh left their slaves and livestock in the field. And so this massive hailstorm comes, and we're told it just beats down the land to the point of the flax and the barley are destroyed. We're told the wheat and the spelt had not yet sprouted. That's going to be taken care of in the next plague that takes place. But it says, this is something that has decimated your land. And he tells Pharaoh comes to him and says that I have sinned, verse 27. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord for me. We have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go, and you won't have to stay any longer. But again, once Moses prays for the hail to go away, we're told that Pharaoh sins again. His heart becomes hard, and he will not let them go. Again, he is a politician. He has no problem lying to Moses, and he can negotiate a ceasefire, and the hailstorm goes away. Then he's done his job, and there's no need to let them go. He has averted the disaster at this time, or so he thinks. And so God sends Moses back to him and says, look, they've grown hard. So tell the people that this is what's going to happen next. He goes to Pharaoh and says, in chapter 10, verse 6, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so that they may worship me. And if you refuse to let them go, I will bring locusts into your country tomorrow. Again, God is specifying when these things are going to happen, whether they are natural type disasters that happen in Egypt throughout a year. Anyway, it is emphasized throughout here that it is at God's command that they start. It's at God's command that it stops. This is the control that he has, and that all of these plagues are worse than anything that has ever happened in the past. And he has differentiated between the Israelites and the Egyptians. While there's the horrible hailstorm amongst the Egyptians and tears up their fields and destroys their crops, it doesn't hail in Goshen where the people of Israel are. Same thing happens with the locust storm that comes. Though it's interesting when the officials come to him, and how long will this man be a snare to us? Don't you know that, realize that Egypt is ruined? And he said, and so he brings them back and says, well, I'll let you go, but who's going? Again, Pharaoh's negotiating. And Moses says, everybody, young, old, male, female, and all of our animals. And Pharaoh says, no, I know this is all just a ruse. You're just trying to get away and get away from your work and find your own freedom. You're bent on evil, he refers to it. Have only the men go worship the Lord. And at this point is when God says, tell Moses as to stretch out your arm and the locust will swarm over the land. And he uses a eastern wind to blow in locusts, which were known to breed in the eastern steppes of Asia and Arabia. and he blows them in such number that they cover everything. And we're told that there never been such a plague of locusts, that there never will be again, verse 14. And they covered all the ground until it was black, and nothing green remained on tree or plant in the land of Egypt. And we're told now that the wheat and the spelt are gone, which they blossomed a couple of months after the other things that are mentioned back in chapter 9, the flax and the barley. And the trees are stripped of their leaves and any fruit that they have on them. This is just utter devastation to the economy and especially the food source of so much of Egypt, and especially what they were already at this time a major exporter of wheat to other countries. And so not only have they been devastated personally, but their economy is devastated and future business is. And again, Pharaoh quickly summons and says, I have sinned again, verse 16 of chapter 10. Now forgive me once more and pray to Lord God, the plague, take it away from me. And again, he prays, the locust, another eastern wind comes in and blows them out into the Great Sea. And once it's over again, Pharaoh hardens his heart. And again, we go back and forth here between Pharaoh hardens his heart, and here verse 20, and the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. He would not let the Israelites go. And so we've made our way through various natural disasters that challenge the powers of different ones of the Egyptian gods. And we come to the final, this one, which is an assault on the greatest of all the Egyptian gods, which is the sun god Ra. And now that there is 3 days of darkness, and we're told that as a darkness that they felt. If you've ever been in a place like Carlsbad Caverns, and when they take you down into the caverns and they turn out all the lights, and it's just an eeriness, it's like, the darkness is just all around you, touching you. And we don't know if it's this kind of darkness that is upon them. Some have speculated that it was a great dust storm that was so thick that it caused darkness in the land for these 3 days. But again, there is a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. The Israelites had light. The Egyptians do not for these 3 days. And so Pharaoh this time at the end of chapter 10 says, all right, you can go, but leave your livestock. Whether this is, he knows that they are a pastoral people and they will never agree to do this, or if it's, he's trying to salvage something from this and at least get to keep the flocks and the livestock. And Moses says, no, we have to take these with us. We don't know what we're going to need to sacrifice to the Lord when we get to the place where he wants us to go on this religious pilgrimage. And so we must do what he says. And again, we are told that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. He's not willing to let them go. And he is so upset at Moses at this time. He tells him to leave, and I never want to see you again. And Moses concludes in verse 29, just as you say, I will never appear before you again. Before he leaves, we have chapter 11, where he explains to him what is about to happen. Again, he wants them to know ahead of time that if you will not repent, he says, tell the people, the men and women are like, this is what you're to do. Tell the people what God is going to do on Egypt, and he will cause them to completely drive them out. He's not just going to let them go. He's going to tell them to get out. And he says, tell them this is what the Lord says. At about midnight, I will go throughout Egypt, and every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn of the slave girl who is at her handmill, the firstborn of the cattle as well. And so again, he is tells Pharaoh, this is what's going to happen if you don't let us go. And he gives him the time frame. Each of these times that God sets a time frame, whether it's the next day or this is on a day, and he says it's going to come at midnight. He's giving Pharaoh time to change his mind and to let them go. God is a God who gives people chances. But here's the warning: are you going to listen? Now, he tells the Israelites to start making preparations, what they are going to need to do. And in the midst of chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, we sort of have a mixture of discussions about the preparations that are to take place among the Israelites for the feast, which they are going to celebrate before this happens. Also the consecration of the firstborn, and other things considering the feast of unleavened bread, which we'll look at those things in a few minutes. But if we're just looking at what's taking place in terms of the events, he tells the people, okay, you need to get ready. You're going to prepare. This is to celebrate a feast and start a festival that is going to be the beginning of your year, because this is the beginning of your time in history as a nation. And they are to select that lamb. Now, 1-year-old male lamb, could be a goat or a sheep, doesn't matter. But it was to be without defect. They were to eat bitter herbs, which were to symbolize the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. They were to eat the unleavened bread because they're going to be pushed out so quickly that they're not going to have time to allow the bread to rise. But during this, in preparation for the meal itself, then they slaughter the sheep, the lambs. They take the blood and paint it over their doorposts so that it is a symbol to the angel of death who is coming, that he is to pass over those houses, because a lamb has been slaughtered in celebration of God's deliverance. And this is what the people do. And so at midnight, when God said it was going to happen, we're told in verse 29 of chapter 12, he struck down all the firstborn of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon. When we get to chapter 13, he talks about the consecration of the firstborn and the importance of the Israelites in the future, making sure that every firstborn child and firstborn animal, male children and animals, are to be consecrated. The animals could be sacrificed as a celebration to God, thanking him for what he has given them. And the child is to be redeemed either by that sacrifice or by some kind of payment. In other words, this is redemption is the paying off of a debt. And they are, in essence, turned over to God as his special people, his special celebration and sacrifice that are dedicated to him. Think of how important it was for Hannah to finally have a child, and the dedication and the consecration that she gives on Samuel to prepare him to become someone who is set apart for God and his service. And the Egyptians had the same kind of thing. There was great importance placed on the firstborn male, and whether it's human or animal, and the dedication that gave to their gods. And here is this ultimate defeat of the religious pantheon in Egypt, that God could come at a designated time and take away all of those who had been dedicated to the gods of Egypt. but saved those people who had been saved by the blood of the Lamb. And so there is great mourning throughout the land. The Pharaoh sends messengers to Moses and Aaron and says, you can go, get out, and hurry to do so. He had told the Israelites to ask the Egyptians for supplies, things that they were going to need, even their gold and silver, and that they would plunder the Egyptians in this exit or exodus. And they do that very thing. And it is because it happens so rapidly in this very unexpected way that there is no time to allow for bread to rise. And thus why they would celebrate that celebration in the future as well, not just the Passover night and the sacrifice of the lamb, but also for 7 days they would celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread as a reminder to them about how quickly God worked in bringing about their deliverance. But to make sure that it is understood that this is a complete victory, because behind it all was not only the religious beliefs of the Egyptians or the economic power of the Egyptians, but most of all, their military might. And so God knows his people are not truly safe until that is defeated. And so as the people are set free, they begin moving through the wilderness. God guides them to a couple of different locations and finally sets them in a place. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham at the edge of the desert. And God went ahead of them in day by a pillar of cloud and guide them, and by night there was fire in the cloud, and so could guide them wherever they go, and eventually positions them next to a place that is called the Sea of Reeds, and we'll come back to that in a minute. In the meantime, Pharaoh and his officials are wondering, what have we done? We have just given up this magnificent slave workforce that we have lost so much now in terms of our economy and agriculture and livestock and everything else. We have to get them back. But God ends up sort of using deceptive moves among the people to prepare for the destruction of the Egyptian army that's in pursuit now. And they are coming with horses, they're coming with military, and they're coming with chariots, which was a huge advantage in battle in their day and time. And in fact, the chariot had been introduced to Egypt by the Hyksos, who were Semites who had conquered the northern part of Egypt in this very area where all of this is happening. A couple of 100 years before, potentially was during the time they were ruling during the time when Joseph came there, and the reason why they would easily accept a non-Egyptian to rule over them. But their secret weapon was the chariot. The Egyptians did not have them at that time. They, of course, then developed their own chariots, and they fight back. And after about 100 years or so of being dominated by the Hyksos, they drive them out. And now this is a major part of their weaponry. But God keeps them separated as they approach. He puts the cloud filled with fire between them and the Egyptian army to protect them, and keeps that in between them all night long while he brings in this great wind again from the east and piles up walls of water in this sea of reeds. It's unfortunate that still many English translations translate this as the Red Sea, because it's not a reference to the Red Sea. Number one, the word that's used here for Sea of Reeds, it's the same that was used for the area where Moses's little boat was placed amongst the reeds to hide him until he could be found and cared for by Pharaoh's daughter. And reeds only grow in fresh water, not in salt water. So this is not a part of anything that was the salt water of the Red Sea. And we'll discuss a little bit more in a few minutes, the exact location. But the point is not so much where this is, how much water is involved. It is that it's sort of the coming around of the symbolism of all that they had done, the Egyptians, to the people of Israel, and in trying to kill off their children, now have experienced the death of the firstborn of their children, the most important to them. And now where Moses' life is saved by being put in water amongst the reeds, here the people of Israel as a whole are saved by God driving the walls of water wherever this is, and where they can walk across on dry land. And when they are finally reach the other side and the Egyptians are set free to pursue them, though there is much confusion, we're told that the chariots begin to lose their wheels. There's great confusion amongst the people. They are now immersed in this muddy muck that would be the natural way in which this area of water with the reeds would be like. And then these walls of water that have been piled up by God in some form or in some way now descend upon them, and the army that is in pursuit is destroyed. But as many of them have already fled because they see the great confusion and that God is working against them. And we're even seeing chapter 14, they're thrown into confusion, made the wheels of their chariots came off so that they had difficulty driving. The Egyptians said, let us get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Yahweh is fighting for them against Egypt. And Moses stretches out his hand again. The waters return. And it pursues the water, then sweeps them into this sea. There are a number of freshwater bodies between north of the Sea of Red Sea, between there and the Mediterranean Sea. One of them being the Great Bitter Lake, which is easily large enough for an event like this to happen. It is the lake which they have dug from the Red Sea up to that lake and then to other lakes north of that, the Suez Canal, so that ships could cut across down either from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea or vice versa. So again, we have no idea exactly where this is. That's not the point. The point is what God does with this and the symbolism which it brings about the completion of the destruction of Egypt. They have been defeated religiously. They have been defeated economically. Pharaoh himself has now been defeated. And his military has been defeated. And these people are truly set free. And chapter 15 is this beautiful song from Moses, which they sing to the Lord, for he has highly exalted the horse and its rider is hurled into the sea. It is this magnificent soaring song of God's power and victory. And beginning in verse 13, starts singing about the future and how God will lead them, the hope that they now have. And Miriam chimes in verse 21, sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider has hurled into the sea. This is the God who has completely defeated the great and mighty Egypt. As part of all this, we saw that there are these instructions about the festival that is to take place, and they are told that it is to take place in the first month of every year. They don't want them to forget this is a celebration of their beginnings and who has delivered them. Because the Israelites did nothing through all of this. The only time they are asked to get involved is during the 10th plague, and that is in the choosing of the lamb, the sacrificing of the lamb, the preparing of the meal, and the spreading of the blood over the door frames. That's all they're asked to do. And because they obey and do that, they are saved. They are passed over in this horrible night of death. And this is the beginning. And now they have truly crossed the sea into new lands and freedom because of the blood of the Lamb. It also involved the bitter herbs and the unleavened bread. And I just want to take a moment to make sure that we see the comparisons of what are mentioned throughout the Gospels in the establishment of the Lord's Supper, which took place during the celebration of the Passover meal of Jesus with his disciples. All of them mention the unleavened bread. All of them mention the bitter herbs. In fact, it is the bitter herbs that Jesus says that the one who dips his bread in bitter herbs with me is the one who's going to betray me. Those bitter herbs symbolize the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. And Jesus is about to experience the bitterness of being beaten, being betrayed, and being crucified. But he makes sure that it is understood that now the unleavened bread is represents his body. Again, in what happens in Jerusalem and at Calvary, and then later with the resurrection, is a rapid and unexpected deliverance. Even though Jesus had been telling his disciples that this is what was going to happen, they still were not expecting it, and it still comes in a way in which nobody is thinking it's going to happen. It's unexpected and it's rapid. For just like in that night, they are driven out of the land into freedom through the death, burial, and especially resurrection of Jesus Christ. We have victory over death through the blood of the Lamb. And it is accomplished completely and total, complete victory over sin and the consequence of sin, which is death. And it is brought about through the blood of the Lamb, who suffered the bitterness of rejection and crucifixion, and whose body is broken like the unleavened bread. We now partake of those things. And it's interesting how none of the gospel accounts talk about the eating of the roasted lamb. Some have speculated that this was a different kind of celebration. It didn't include a lamb. It was sort of a pared down Passover. I don't think Jesus would have done that. When he told his disciples, go into town and prepare the Passover, they understood what all was involved in that. I think they don't mention that because they want to make sure that it is understood. Jesus is the lamb, and it's going to be his blood that saves us. In fact, it is that is set out from the very beginning in the Gospel of John, where John the Baptist says in chapter 1, verse 29, behold, Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, as Jesus walks by. And then there's those images throughout the Gospel of John. Jesus as the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep, who is Jesus, who is the bread of life. And we must eat of his flesh and drink of his blood and find life in him. There's so many connections here. But it began with this event in Egypt. And it was important for the Israelites to never forget it. It's important for us to never forget it. And it's important for us to make sure that not just once a year, but every first day of the week, as those early Christians did, that we remember the blood of the Lamb that suffered for us. And it is his body that was broken for us. And we celebrate in that unleavened bread, that body that had lived a perfect life, that was unblemished. And it was his blood that is now the blood of the covenant, his covenant, in which we come into a relationship with God. We are saved from death to live in his presence. And this is the journey that the Israelites are on and that we have been on, and we continue as we follow Jesus each and every day. And it's important that we pass this on, that we talk about this on a regular basis, not only in our worship services every Sunday, but with our children and with our friends and those in the world. For God had even told Pharaoh that he wanted to show Egypt his great power, the fullness of his power, so that he would be praised throughout the world. And that is still our goal as we share the good news of the greatest deliverance that has ever taken place. Not Israel out of Egypt, but all of us out of sin and death through the blood of the Lamb, Jesus, who has come to take away the sins of the world. We are going to continue in our study next week, looking here at the end of chapter 14 and following, as they make their journey now from freedom from Egypt and all the things that they have witnessed there, finally to arrive at Mount Sinai, the mountain of God, the place where God had appeared to Moses in the burning bush and told him, "This is how you will know who I am. When you return to this mountain with the people having been set free." And that is the journey that they're on. But it is difficult. It's a struggle, because as we recall, the name Israel itself means struggles with God, and these people struggle with him mightily in trying to come to grips with what does it mean to live in covenant relationship with the I am, the one who will be who he will be to fulfill his promises to us. And that is the journey in which we will be taking in the weeks to come. I thank you for joining us today. Hope that this has been informative for you, and we look forward to you joining us again in the future.